about Jesus. We'll sing the chorus after verses 1 and 4 only. We'll sing all 4 verses, the chorus after verses 1 and 4. Dismissed, Chuck.
Is the clicker back here? Yeah. That's it. Thank you. We got off to a good start, didn't we? If you want to be turning your Bibles to Numbers chapter 32, that is where we will be, Numbers chapter 32. We're going to finish up just a few things, some application points from Numbers chapter 32, and we're going to get on into chapter 33. And Numbers chapter 33 probably will not go down as the most exciting chapter of the Bible. There's an itinerary there for Israel's travel. However, having said that, it may be more exciting than you would think, at least more significant than you might think. And so we're going to talk more about how it functions. Why is this big, long itinerary in there? Why was it important to the book of Numbers? What's behind it? And when you look at what's behind it all at once, it kind of takes on a whole new and fresh context for us. And then when we get to the end of chapter 33, he's going to give some instructions for Israel again as they come into Canaan, which in its own way, even though they're very stern warnings, is also encouraging to Israel because it says they're going to go into Canaan. This generation is going to get to go into the promised land for certain. He's been saying that, but any of these instructions, even if they seem a little dense to us, remember every command, every instruction about going into Canaan implies the blessing that they're going to be going into Canaan, which means they're going to be going into the promised land. And of course, there was a first generation that didn't. And we'll talk about some different aspects of that. Now, one of the things we noticed in chapter 32, or the major thing in chapter 32, are these 2.5 tribes in the Transjordan area that say, hey, this looks really good. The pasture looks really good. We have wives and children and all kinds of livestock. Chapter 32 makes that clear. They had all kinds of livestock. And this looked really good. And this would have been a good place. And there were places for them to live and all of this. So they come to Moses and they come to the leadership and they present this idea. And we studied this last week. And how does that go? Not super well. Now, we would say, we learned from them, were they humble and did they approach it, in the best way? Yeah, that they thought of. They probably, there's different ideas about this, but I would say that at the very least, they might have been a little bit more explicit and clear about what their intentions were, or their intentions kind of changed as Moses responded, one or the other. I think probably they had this in mind, they just didn't get it all out in a specific way. And so what was Moses' response to them? These 2.5 tribes, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and then half of Manasseh. How did Moses respond? Anybody?
I felt like they were not fulfilling their obligation to the president of the Lord's command.
Right. So this was more like, this is what Moses is hearing. Moses is hearing, because he's heard it before, hasn't he? If you go back to the spies, remember the majority of the spies come back with an evil, distrustful report. You have 2 that are faithful. And who were the 2 that were faithful again? Joshua and Caleb? Okay, so what he's hearing, this sounds familiar. I mean, he's heard this before from Israel. And in his mind, this is about to jeopardize the whole nation of Israel and their resolve to go into Canaan. And what he's also hearing is that they don't really want to go fight. They don't want to go, because when they go into Canaan, it's not like nobody's over there. And they're going to have these wars and battles. Now, God has promised to be with them and bless them and all of that. But what he's hearing is, we'll just not cross. This is really good. We're good to go. And what ends up happening? What do they come back to Moses with? Moses is very stern with him. In fact, if you look at chapter 32, you'll notice in verse 10, so the Lord's anger burned in that day, and he swore, saying, none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, for they did not follow me fully. He goes on to talk about the past history and what happened to that first generation. And in his mind, he's thinking, here we go again. So he's really upset about this, and you can understand why. But what do they come back and say? Yeah. That information right there changes the whole context of this conversation. And so they're saying, no, wait a minute, we'll leave our little ones, our children, our wives here, but we're going to go over. And not only are they going to go fight, and this is really important, I think, and we see that this actually happened. Not only are they going to go over there to fight, where are they going to be when they go? Out front. I mean, actually, that makes a lot of sense in its own way, because they're going to be a lot more mobile. They're not going to be carrying all their livestock and families and all that. So they say, not only will we go fight, we'll be out front. And once everything's been conquered and we've received this inheritance, then we'll come back here. Well, of course, that changes the whole context. So that's chapter 32. I want to make a couple of points that comes out from Moses' concerns about this that I think are important for us as we think about all of this. And here it is. First of all, and we do have this tendency, I think all of us probably do, but certainly in our society, we've seen this, and we've seen impacts on our families, we've seen impacts on local churches. It's the idea that, it's my right to make my own mind up, make my own decisions, as if our personal decisions don't impact other people. And, when you think about sin, and I think Moses even says, your sin will surely find you out here, which is a familiar section there that often is quoted. And his point is there's consequences. So He was concerned that they weren't just making decisions for themselves as 2.5 tribes, but think about it for a minute. We mentioned this. If you go back to those spies, you had 10 men that influenced Israel. What are 2.5 tribes going to do to influence Israel? This is how Moses is thinking, and you can understand it. And from an application standpoint, it's important for us to know that our decisions, yes, they impact our souls. I mean, they impact our relationship with God, but they can also have impact and influence, and do often, on our families, on maybe the congregation that we're a part of, and all of that. So I think that's really important to notice that our individual decisions can have an impact on others, and we don't ever need to underestimate that. So as I'm making the decision, often, what Satan wants you to do is he doesn't want you to think about that. He just wants you to think about satisfying your own desires. Now, that's bad enough all by itself, but when you add to that, not thinking about others. You think about people who are involved in extramarital affairs and things like that. Yeah, that jeopardizes their soul, but that impacts everybody. That impacts their spouse. It can impact their children. It's going to impact the congregation. It's going to impact the influence that they would have otherwise had. And certainly we can repent and God will forgive us, but there can be ongoing difficulties that we deal with. And it's not just in that, but there's certain sins more so. You probably think that, there's certain decisions like that, yeah, they have an impact. But if we could think about that before, and I think even people that have made those kinds of mistakes where it's impacted their influence would tell you if they could go back and make that decision again and really think about, if they had really thought about what was going to happen, maybe they would have made a different decision, or certainly they would have made a different decision. So there is an important lesson here, and it's a lesson Jesus warns us about. Look at Matthew chapter 18 and verses 6 and 7. Matthew, the 18th chapter. And let's read this section a little bit. Matthew chapter 18. And actually, let's go ahead and read I would like for us to read verses 1 through 11. Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. Mike Biko, if you could.
The disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offenses come. If your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell fire. Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost."
Thank you very much. So when you start out, of course, he talks about having the mindset of a child and being dependent on the Lord and trusting the Lord and being humble in that way, and who's really great in the kingdom of heaven. It seems to me as you move through and he keeps using that idea of a child or children, he's not only talking about a child from a physical standpoint. In the context as it continues, I think Jesus is talking about new disciples and fellow disciples and how we treat one another and having that attitude that he had talked about earlier in this section. But clearly, his language here is that decisions impact other people. Now, we can think of some infamous decisions that impacted other people. You think of Adam and Eve, Judas Iscariot. I mean, we can think of those. But think about David and the sins that he committed. That really comes out in the 51st Psalm as he begs God for mercy. But there were ongoing, physical consequences for that. You had the loss of a child. And because I don't think God ever reaches under the hood and forces anybody to make a particular decision. But even though he repented, when you get into Absalom and Amnon and Tamar and all of that scandal impacted his family and impacted Israel and impacted him in many ways, even though he was forgiven and he repented of that. So we certainly see that. And Paul would talk to us in Philippians 2 about putting the interest of others before ourselves. Now, on the other hand, we impact other people in a positive way. Paul said, follow me as I'm following Christ. Don't follow me if I'm wrong, but follow me as I'm following Christ. And so we have to make a choice. Do I want my decisions to have a negative impact on people, or do I want them to have a positive impact? Now, when the Israelites come back and say, hey, we're going to go over and we're going to be in front of this line and we're going to help Israel and we're going to fight and we're not going to come back until this area is conquered. Well, now that's an encouraging resolve. Is that going to help Israel go on? Yeah, it is. So what looked like it's going to be a bad impact ends up being actually a very encouraging thing for Israel. And here's the other thing I want to mention before we move on, and that is Moses is very sensitive, and we need to be too, as they follow truth and do what's right and are willing to engage in this spiritual battle for the importance of pursuing unity. Israel, there needs to be cohesion there in order to accomplish God's will in the promised land. Philip J. Budd wrote a commentary on Numbers, it's a pretty good one, and he says, without this perception of a common identity and a single goal, the activity of agents of God's rule is liable to become ineffective. And that's just a kind of fancy way to say they need to be on the same page when they're going over there. And if there's a lot of disruption and division and all of that, and you have, if you were to have 2.5 tribes saying, we don't know about this, that's not going to be good. And the same is true for us too. All right? Any questions or comments? Kelton, before we move on.
Moses kept it in this common identity, thinking of all the people when he could have been thinking, you want to stay on this side of the Jordan?
Right.
I can't go over there. All this time I've led these people. I can see it, but I can't go over. And you're telling me you don't want to even go over there?
Well, that's a good point, Kelton.
He didn't focus on himself. He focused on the people.
So here, that's a good point, that here Moses is, he wants to go over there, and he's not going to be permitted to go over there. He'll get to see it. And here these people are that could go over there, and they're saying, no, we're okay right here. But of course, everything comes out in the conversation, in the discussion. And I think that, yeah, go ahead, Alan.
You alluded to this, maybe expand a little bit more on it, the wisdom that these tribes would have had to have a foresight, know that what I'm presenting may create an issue. And that's what we need to pray for is wisdom, to know, to see things from the beginning. Because, I mean, what they brought to Moses about, I mean, it just was very explosive. And either they didn't think it was early on so that we can
That's a
avoid
good point.
confrontation.
Yeah, so if they had, to your point, Alan, like you said, if they had started the conversation out that way, if they said, listen, Moses, we're going to go over with Israel. Not only are we going to go over, we're willing to be on the front line because we're going to be very mobile. But we would like to leave our children and our wives here, right here, and then we'll go over ahead of time, and then when everything's done, we'll come back. You're right, Moses that would have relieved him. And you have to think about it from Moses' standpoint, based on what he knew at the time, based on the history and what's happened with Israel and all of that, based on what he knew at the time, I can see why he would, and he's coming to the end of his life. He knows he's almost to the end of his life. Man, that would just be if that had actually been what they were going to do, that would have been terrible. And yet it comes around. Now, I will say this about Moses. Moses is stern, but he kept listening to them. And they kept talking in a respectful way. They don't seem like they get mad at Moses. I think they probably realized, okay, wait a minute, let's go further with this. And so there are a lot of lessons to learn. Yeah.
And good courage. I think in the church sometimes we can get this competitive relationship with one another instead of encouraging one another.
Yeah.
I believe that's so important for us to have unity, is to, especially as our young people grow up, we need to constantly encourage them. Think about Barnabas being the son of encouragement. So I think that's very important from a unity.
Right, that's right. And there, as you move into Joshua, which Joshua had been Moses' assistant for all that time, he had shown good faith in the situation with the spies. But it is interesting when you get to Joshua 1, to your point, there's encouragement there, and we need for that unity. You've got to keep that encouragement going. But sometimes you kind of say, okay, what are we encouraging? Like you're saying, we encourage young people, we encourage all people to follow the Lord. In that context in Joshua 1, of course, that encouragement was the Lord will be with you, but do you remember what he said? You don't turn to the right hand or to the left, and God will be with you. And that needs to be the message for us. That needs to be the message for us, that we don't want to turn to the right or to the left. We want to follow what God says. And that's where the blessing is, but there has to be encouragement. Put yourself in Joshua's situation. You're about to take over for Israel, and you get to follow Moses, okay? So if you're following Moses, but he seems very much up for that job, God knew his character. He knew his purpose. He had been close to Moses. He had been mentored by Moses in many ways. So those are all very valid points, okay? Anybody else? All right, let's look at chapter 33. So this is interesting. And, I think this is one of those places when you go back and you look at Numbers, and we've talked about this before, there's such a powerful narrative and story, but there's some sections that if you just look at those sections can scare you off of Numbers, and that would be really sad because it's a powerful book. It's a book that's foreshadowing so much to come and is actually referenced. It's got messianic promises in it. It's got all these wonderful things. But when you come to Numbers 33 and you start to look at it, and if you open into if you get into verse 13 and you start moving through to about verse 37, he's talking about this is where we've been, this is our itinerary, and this is where we've been, and you think, man, didn't we get a little bit of this in chapter 21? And you go, yep, we got a little bit of this in chapter 21, and don't we get some of this in Deuteronomy? Yeah, we get some of this in Deuteronomy. So when we come to a text like that as a Bible student, not that those places don't matter and you can get in. Some of these places haven't been discovered. Some of these places weren't actually cities, they were encampments. So there are those who try to say, well, there's mistakes. There's not mistakes here. You have to harmonize chapter 21, chapter 33, and some things in Deuteronomy. But I don't want us to worry so much about that. I mean, clearly this is the text of Scripture. I would say to you, some of these are cities, and I've got a map for you in a minute. I just wanted to make sure you had it in your material. And you can take this itinerary and get a pretty good idea. There's some different ideas about how they traveled, but you can get a pretty good idea how they traveled from this. Very good idea. Now, I say all that to say, there's something in this section, there's a couple of lessons that are very important for us to learn. So before you see all those cities and places and encampments and go, oh, I'm not a geography guy, think about why. Think about why this itinerary. Why does he keep talking about this? Well, there's several things. One thing is this shows they historically made this journey. This hasn't just been fabricated or something like that. But I want you to think about the context a little bit. So here are the Israelites. They are at the edge of the Jordan. I mean, they are just about to enter Canaan. So after all we've studied and all that they've been through, Moses has been through, and Aaron has passed on, Miriam has passed on. Who's the high priest now? Eleazar. Who is he? Son of Aaron. I mean, there's just been so much we've seen. We're finally there. Now, this would have been a short trip if the first generation had been faithful. But I will say this to you, that this is one of the things interesting to me about the itinerary. He starts out, they go from Egypt. So we talk about Israel. Now think about this for a minute. Israel goes from Egypt to Canaan. The first generation, for the most part, other than, Joshua and Caleb and that kind of thing, that first generation died. But in the grand scheme of things, when you look at Israel as a people, rather than just by generation, when you look at Israel as God's people, the description is God's people, even though you had two generations, God's people left Egypt. And God's people made a short trip into a long trip, but God's people will go to Canaan. So one of the things, we were talking about unity, one of the things to see is we've got to see things in a broader way. And let me kind of explain what I mean. We have brothers in Christ, brothers and sisters in Christ that we all know of previous generations that have been very faithful to the Lord. And they've encouraged us. But maybe they're passing away or have passed away. They've gone on. What would they have desired for us? For us to walk in those footsteps, for us to be faithful. At the end of the equation, as God looks at his purposes, it's not just about one generation or one person, even though we're all individually responsible. We need to look at this in a more corporate way, in a more group-centered way. These challenges God's people had at this time, these challenges we have now, but we are God's people. Okay? And that's the way the Bible presents it. The Bible presents, even though you had these two generations and this one generation started out good and they fell away, and now you get the second generation and they've had their challenges, but here they're about to go into Canaan. The way God looks at this is my people are going to the promised land. And that's the way it's going to be in eternity, and that's the way we need to see it, okay? So as we look at this itinerary, something else, I'll mention this to you a little bit later. This is not unique to Israel to have an itinerary. If you go and you look at, later on, if you look at Assyria and some of these other, this was pretty common, that you would have some record of a journey or warfare or something. And really, let's think about it from this standpoint. Why would someone like the rulers of Assyria want their version of an itinerary or a record of their conquest? Well, that's one thing. Yeah, that's right. What else? What message would they want that to send to coming generations? Yeah, that's it. Encouragement, confidence, victory. Okay, this is what, now one of the things that happen, it's kind of like whoever writes the history gets to control the historical record. The difference here is this is inspired of the Holy Spirit. This is God saying this is what happened. But here's what I want you to think about. And that is that often they would do this to bring, the emperors would want this, kings would want this to bring kind of glory to themselves. Who's the king of Israel in this case? Who's the ruler of Israel? God. God. So this itinerary is saying this is what happened. When, we look at it and go, oh, I can get my map out and let me track it out. And that's okay. That's all right. There's a place for that. But what I'm saying to you is think about, why do we have this? And what this is showing is, just like he promised them, they're going to the promised land. And they're right on the precipice. They're going to go to the promised land. And God is going to be true to his promise. Alan, did you have your hand up a minute ago? Okay. All right. So let's look. The last 7 verses are going to contain God's instructions for what the Israelites were to do when they get there. So look at we'll come back a little bit to some other things, but look at verse 50. When you get past that itinerary, he starts talking about the law of possessing the land. So let's read verses 50 through 56. Kelton, if you would, verses 50 through 56.
All right, 50 through 56.
Yes.
Then the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab, by the Jordan, opposite Jericho, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, When you cross over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places. And you shall take possession of the land and live in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. And you shall inherit the land by lot, according to your families. To the larger you shall give more inheritance, and to the smaller you shall give less inheritance. Wherever the lot falls to anyone, that shall be his. You shall inherit according to the tribes of your fathers. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come about that those whom you let remain of them will become as pricks in your eyes and as thorns in your sides. And they shall trouble you in the land in which you live. And it shall come about that as I plan to do to them, so I will do to you.
Okay, thank you, Kelvin. So let's just look at the instructions pretty quickly. So they're to drive out the inhabitants of the land. That was God's will. How many? All of them. Yeah, it's like my grandfather, when I was a little kid, we'd go by a cemetery and he'd say, Bruce, you know how many dead people there are out there? And I'd say, no, Grandpa. And he'd say, all of them. So all of them. They're all to go, okay? Now, is that what happened? No, they didn't carry through with that. And he told them what would happen if they didn't. They're to just, and you look at just that, and we've already talked about how skeptics misuse that and why. There were several reasons why, but this second issue kind of explains why. They were going to be bad for them. He's already said that. They're going to be hostile. They're going to try to defile you. Now look, Israel's already had a little taste of that, and it wasn't very good. Who came in among them, and God sent a plague, and the Midianites. Yeah, they should know how that's going to come out. Remember Phinehas and the sexual immorality and idolatry of the Midianites? They're trying to undermine them. But they're going to destroy, or they're supposed to destroy the idolatry of the land. I want to talk a little bit about that at the end of our class today. Then the land was to be distributed among the Israelites by lot, and if you were a bigger tribe, you got more. That's just how it went, okay? God was true to his promise. So the rest of Numbers, I just want you to see the big picture here. So if you look at chapter 32 through 36, Moses ends up giving about 5 speeches here in the rest of this regarding the land. So what we have is we had chapter 32, the land allotted to the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half tribe of Manasseh. We've talked about that. Chapter 33, the journey to the land and what was to be done in the future. So that makes sense. Chapter 34, you got the boundaries and distribution of the land. Chapter 35, the Levites. Chapter 36, each tribe's allotment to be kept with the tribe. And you think, okay, what do I need to pull for my life from all of that? And that is, God is true to his promise. God is faithful to do what he says. but often those promises have conditions attached to them. So he had told them, if you follow me, you'll get this land of promise, you'll get the promised land, and I will bless you. But if you walk away from me, if you go into idolatry, if you become unfaithful, was this an unconditional promise? Mm-mm. And so a lot of people today will talk about, well, God somehow owes something literal and physical to Israel. No, Joshua says, at the end of Joshua, he gave them all the land that he had promised them. But he had told them, and you can see it right here from the very beginning, if you're not faithful to me, then you won't get to continue in that prosperity, okay? If they had been faithful, it would be a different story. Okay, so I've mentioned all this. You have this in your material. We've talked about the fact that all of these laws show that God is being true to his promise. Something else about this itinerary I want to talk to you about. If you read through, now a lot of it's about places, but is there ever a time where he talks about more than just a place, moving from this place to that place? Yes. So that kind of gives you some insight. So as he's moving through, now it's interesting, there are some major events he doesn't talk about in the itinerary. You'd think, like, if I'm reading Numbers, I go, how is that not there and how is that not there? But there are things that he does talk about. He talks about Aaron's death. He talks about different events. So it must be more than just getting the map out. What he does is he says, listen, there are some historic victories. This goes back to the encouragement. And we'll notice some of those, but that's just what I want you to see, is that really the purpose in that was for them to remember at least two things. Remember, Israel's made mistakes in the past, and you want to know about those so you don't make those again. Don't make those again, even though they did make some of those mistakes, but don't make those mistakes again. Number two, try to learn from history. But number two, remember, God has been good to you. God has been faithful. And so as you go into battle, you're thinking, I know what God has done. I know who he is. I know what he will do. Okay, well, we talked about that last week. All right, so there's some other things you have in your material. We're not going to get into this. I just wanted you to have this chart. It kind of tracks out. If you look at the itinerary, I give you some of the original sections where we read about this earlier, and so historically it's very accurate. If you're a bookworm and want to go back and look at that, that's fine. I know this is hard to see, but if you take the itinerary, you can see how things track for them. And you have other maps in your material, but just wanted you to have that. So what is all this really about? It's about a review and it's about a challenge. He's reviewing the past. He's challenging them. Let's be faithful to God. Let's go. Don't get bogged down in your mistakes of the past. Learn from them. Okay, it's a lesson for us. Learn from them. And also, look at what God has done victoriously in your own history, in your own life, and let that continue as you walk by faith in him. Some of the events, though, I wanted to mention to you, he certainly recounts the Exodus in verses 3 and 4. He mentions Aaron's death, 37 through 39. He mentions victories over Canaanite kings, verse 40. He does mention some places that were associated with past sins of Israel. So he does talk about their mistakes, but he also talks about a lot of victory in that itinerary. So if I'm reading through Numbers, rather than worrying too much about getting bogged down in the specifics, and if you want to do that, that's good. I've read about all those places and that kind of thing, and I think that's beneficial on some level. But I just want us to get the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that these names and events trigger powerful memories and lessons, whether of Israel's own unfaithfulness or the Lord's judgment. You could probably think of some places. I could give you some places, and nobody here would know why that's significant to me. If I said 107 Doris Lane, Gosnell, Arkansas, you'd go, okay, Bruce, what are you talking about? But that's where I grew up. And so just me thinking, I don't think of just the location. I think about what happened at that location, okay? And you have a place. Maybe it was a trip, a vacation. Maybe it's somewhere your family used to go. There are places that it's not just the place. It's the event. And so if you look at Numbers, I think he's saying to Israel, yeah, remember that place, but also remember what's going down. Remember what's happening. Remember God's faithfulness. Remember things you need to learn from. And so he goes ahead and gives these commands. We see it in Exodus and Deuteronomy, driving out those inhabitants of the land. We talked about that last week an awful lot. And why? Because idolatry is going to pose a significant threat to what they need to be doing. But I want to show you something in this context. If I can get there, here it is. Look at, notice with me, verse 52. He says, you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you. And notice what he says, and you look at your translation. Mine, I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible. He says, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places, and you take possession of the land and live in it, for I have given the land to you to possess it. Now, I want to talk about verse 52 for just a minute. Todd, in the Old King James Version, can you read verse 52 to us? Numbers chapter 33, verse 52.
Then ye shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their pictures, and destroy all their molten images, and quite pluck down all their high places.
There you go. Okay. Different translations render that. Some have carved images. Some. Okay. Let's think about that for just a minute in the remaining time we have. So when you go into the land, he says there's going to be idols. There's going to be high places. There's going to be images. Who are those images going to be about? It's going to be about idolatry. I mean, not only have they been involved in idolatry, but you have all of these very physical, tangible things that are about loyalty to their idol. Okay. When you go over there, because even if you drive them out, if you let that stuff remain, who might that influence? Israel. Okay. So notice what's happening here, and this is interesting. Remember in Genesis 1:26 through 28, who does he say we've been created, or how have we been created? In the image of God. In the image of God. Remember Romans 1 when he talks about the Gentiles' departure from God, and he talks about the fact that they were worshiping idols. They made those images. They made those gods. Here's my point to you. When Israel goes to the promised land, whose image were they supposed to be spreading and showing and demonstrating? God. The image of Yahweh. The image of God. This world loves its idols. You go, well, how does that apply today? Well, we live in a world, and they promote their false images of what it means to live and what it means to be a human being. And our responsibility as God's people today is to tear down those false images, at least in our own mind and in the minds of others as we spread the gospel of Christ. Because preaching Jesus is about seeing God's image and having God's image be lived out in our lives. That's what Israel was called to do. That is something we're also called to do. We'll stop right there.